This is Erin Somerville, and I'm going over how a bill becomes a law. You're going to find all of that information in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 7. So Article 1 is the article having to do with the legislative branch, and Section 7 is where you will find the process. Now, we know that we have a bicameral Congress, so we have a House of Representatives, and we also have a Senate. And our Senate has 100 senators in it, that's 2 per state, and the House of Representatives has 435. And this demonstrates the Great Compromise, in which representation would be based on population, so that large states would feel fairly represented, and the Senate allows for state equality, giving every state the same number of votes in this lawmaking institution. So you have the House and you have the Senate, and they're both needed to make a bill into a law. A bill can be introduced in the Senate or in the House of Representatives. It doesn't really matter which order. For the bill to become a law, it will have to go through both chambers. There is an exception, though, to that, or there's sort of a caveat. The very first sentence in Section 7 explains that if it is a revenue bill, meaning a bill that's going to collect taxes, a revenue bill must start in the House of Representatives. I'd like you to think for a moment why that would be. All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose or concur with amendments as on other bills. Okay, so tax bills must start here. And a good way to remember that is thinking back to the mantra of the American Revolution: no taxation without representation. If Americans won their independence on the premise that they didn't want to be under a government in which people were taxed without being given representation, it would stand to reason that the new government created should have plenty of representation tied up with taxing power. But other than a tax bill, it really doesn't matter which chamber it starts in. It will go through both chambers. Now, a bill gets introduced in the Senate by a senator or introduced in the House of Representatives by a representative. And before the entire chamber, meaning all 435 people, start to research and debate this bill and vote on it, we need something more efficient. Because there's only 365 days in a year, there's 435 representatives, thousands of bills that get introduced, so the work gets divided up. And when a bill comes in, let's say it has to do with a dairy subsidy, well, it's going to go to a group of people in the House of Representatives that know all about agricultural legislation. It will go to what's called a subcommittee. Or it might go straight to the committee. It might go through both. But the idea is send it to a few representatives in the subcommittee who know a whole lot about the topic, and they will decide if changes should be made, if this should be recommended, or not waste the representatives' time on a full vote. And if it somehow gets through the subcommittee, through the committee, it will go to a committee that only exists in the House. It's the powerful Rules Committee. The Rules Committee, they make the rules, but not the general rules. They make the rules dependent on the bill being discussed. So the Rules Committee, they might get the legislation and say, well, we're going to make it so that each representative can speak only up to 3 minutes, and only up to 2 times. That way they, expedite the process. They make the rules for the debate on this particular bill. And on another bill later on, they might make different rules. So the Rules Committee is like a powerful traffic cop. And sometimes they are able to just put the debate for the bill, make it so that it doesn't even get on the schedule, on the docket. If it makes it out of the Rules Committee, Then it goes to the full House. All 435 representatives, or at least the ones present, get to debate and vote. And they'll debate and vote according to the Rules Committee's rules. If they debate and vote, out of the 435, according to the Constitution, you just need a simple majority to pass. And a simple majority of 435 is half plus 1, so that'd be 218 today. So if it started in the House, it can't go to the President yet. It will go to the Senate and do something quite similar. It will go to a subcommittee that specializes on that topic, back out to the main committee. And then it goes to the leadership, the Senate leadership, which we'll be talking about later. But the Senate leadership would be the majority and minority leaders. And what they decide is they decide to schedule it, because it's a busy schedule and it might not be something they have time to vote on, or they're going to expedite it and get voted on right away. If they put it on the schedule, then it will go to the full Senate. And again, there they can debate and vote. Debate's a little less constrained because they don't have a Rules Committee in the Senate. And again, you just need a simple majority according to the Constitution to pass. And a simple majority of 100 would be 50 plus 1, so that would be 51 senators. And then it would go to the President. This bill could have started in the Senate so long as it wasn't a tax bill, and if that were the case, I'm going to show you the path that would go with the dotted line. It would do the same thing through the Senate first, what I want you to see here is it doesn't go through both houses simultaneously. It goes through them separately. So that makes the lawmaking process pretty slow because these are not happening at the same time. It goes through one and then goes through the other. The order doesn't matter unless it's a revenue bill. It has to start in the House. Okay, so those are the broad strokes. Now we're going to add in some of the more complex things to consider here. These committees, the idea is that they are going to filter. They're going to take legislation that's pretty good, then they'll make some revisions that make it better, or they will say this is not good, this is not worth our time and our vote. And so often what the committees and subcommittees in both houses will do is they will table it. Meaning they say, this bill we're not sure on, we're going to set it aside, we're going to table it. That means that it's dead. That means that they're never coming back to it. And when the legislative session ends, everything that was on the table will get dumped out. Most bills die in committee. And perhaps that's a good thing, because we do need to make sure only quality bills get discussed and get voted on. Let's add a few things about the committees. They can make revisions. We might call those amendments. And they might do research. They might hold hearings where before they want to make their decision, they're going to gather information from people or groups that know about this topic. And ultimately, they're going to recommend the legislation be voted on, or they're going to table it. They're going to recommend it to go down to the full chamber or table it, which just means it's dead. It will not go any further. And that's where most bills meet their fate. And let's add the Rules Committee. They make the rules for debate. Okay, in this section, Article 1, Section 7, it says that you just need a simple majority from both chambers and you send it to the President. But we just acknowledged here that both chambers have an opportunity to make revisions. So let's imagine a bill makes it through the House, but when it goes through the Senate, a couple things are added or changed. you have these alterations. So you could end up with version A coming out of the Senate and version B coming out of, version A out of the House and B out of the Senate. Which one goes to the president? Well, neither, because in order for a law to happen, according to the Constitution, anything sent to the president must be passed by both chambers. And version B never was voted on by the House. Version A was never voted on by the Senate. And so what happens is a conference committee forms. And this group has members from both chambers. So it's going to send some senators, some representatives, and they get together to iron out the differences and make a compromise bill. So the conference committee makes compromise bill. Members from both houses, both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Okay, now they have made a new bill, version C. Can C go to the president? Well, again, here we have the problem. Version C was not passed by the House nor the Senate, and so it wouldn't be constitutional to send that to the president. So version C needs to get voted on by the House and Senate. At this point, the process is expedited, and it goes directly to the full House, and it goes to the full Senate at the same time. So they skip all the committees, goes to the full House for a vote. And if the simple majority is gotten there, then it actually can go to the president now that it's been approved by both chambers. So we see here that for a bill to become a law, we have the legislative branch doing most of the work, legislative meaning making laws, legislate. But the president, our chief executive, does have a role in the process. It's at the end. It's an important role, and we're going to get to that shortly. I want to point out the additional checks and balances that we have. You have the House and Senate essentially limiting one another. Congress can't get anything done unless both can work together. This is what we call intra-branch checks and balances. It's a nice sort of extra perk that you get from bicameralism. Bicameralism being the fact that we have two chambers. So we have bicameralism, meaning that two chambers in our legislative body, and that gives us extra intra-branch checks and balances. Intra meaning within as opposed to inter. Okay, so the Congress has done the heavy lifting of getting the law passed, and now they send it to the president. The president has a few options at this point. He can sign it. If he signs the bill, it becomes a law. Woohoo, all done. His other option is to veto it. You won't find the word veto it in Article 1, Section 7. Because the president he doesn't just stamp it and say, no, I don't like it. That would be not constructive. We want the two branches to work together in making laws. When he vetoes it, technically what he is doing is he's sending it back with a list of objections. So he makes the list of objections saying, here's what you ought to change, Congress. If you make those changes, then I will sign it. And so after he comes up with the list of objections, it's supposed to go back to whichever chamber it started in. And back to chamber it began in. And that's usually the end of it. So that's why we think of it as a veto, because that's usually like nothing else can happen. So if he does this, and let's say for this bill, since I have these solid lines, it goes back to the House. Well, there's still a chance for Congress to override the veto, but this is now going to be much more difficult. You have to start all over, starting back into the House, and go back through the Senate, back to him. But the difference here is to override the veto, the voting requirement changed to 2/3. So in order to override a veto, then you need a 2/3 vote in each chamber. That's if you want to keep the bill as it was. Now, if you listen to the president's objections, you make those changes, now you're actually passing a new law and you still need only the simple majority. But if you're trying to keep the same bill you sent to the president in which he vetoed it as it is, then when it comes back, now you're going to need 290 representatives and 67 senators. Going to be much harder to do. It is possible. It's not often. It's not done often. Now, the other thing the president can do is nothing. He can ignore it. And the question is, what happens if he fails to act? He doesn't sign it or veto it. Is it a law or is it not? That actually depends on what Congress is doing. All the folks that work up on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., they are working a few days a week, not every day of the year, not every week of the year. They adjourn. They leave after they've done their job. When they're in session, that means they're there. When they're adjourned, they've gone home and nobody's there. If the president ignores it, his time limit is 10 days, excluding Sundays. I'm not going to write excluding Sundays, but he's got 10 days to make a decision. And then, here's what happens. It all depends on where Congress is. If Congress is adjourned, we'll put Congress in session. Meaning they're waiting for his list of objections. He hasn't signed it, so they're waiting to see if he's going to veto it and send them a list of objections. So Congress is in session, or maybe Congress has adjourned. Okay, so if Congress is in session, so it doesn't feel so tricky, let's try to follow the logic. Congress is waiting. Perhaps the president has very constructive objections and Congress will listen to those objections, make changes, or maybe they are waiting to override it. Either way, they're waiting. Tick tock, tick tock. They're waiting to do their job. They've worked hard on passing this bill, and after 10 days, the president never signed it or vetoed it while they were waiting after doing their job. In this instance, it's going to become a law anyways, even without a signature. So if 10 days passes, Congress is waiting to finish the job of working with the president to make laws, and he doesn't do his end of it, then it's going to automatically become a law. Now, in the other instance, let's assume the president's on day 9, Congress adjourns, they feel done, and then he has made his objections on the 10th day. He wants to send those over to the House and Senate to continue the process, but knock knock, nobody is there to listen to his objections. Nobody is there to override his veto. In that case, it's not a law. And that's called a pocket veto. So he didn't really make the objections, he didn't really veto it, but Congress wasn't around for him to work with in order to pass the legislation. Okay, so we can see that this process is quite tricky. There's a lot of hurdles. The likelihood of any bill becoming a law is not great, and that's what the framers had intended. They wanted to make sure that a piece of legislation was not tricky to pass in order to promote stability, but we could see how this would also create a lot of gridlock. The last piece I just want to talk briefly about has to do with the political parties. The president can represent a political party, a Democrat or a Republican. And the House of Representatives might have a majority of Democrats or a majority of Republicans, and the Senate will have a majority of Republicans or a majority of Democrats. If both the president and Congress are controlled by the same party, we could assume legislation might get passed more easily. It's not going to be that easy because you still have all these checks and balances built in, but we assume at least you wouldn't have partisan bickering slowing down the process. And the term for that, when the executive branch and the legislative branch are controlled by the same party, that's called a unified government. And when you have a president from one party and Congress controlled by another, that's divided government. We would assume that this adds to the complexity of checks and balances. The committees, which are the most powerful part of the process because they really decide whether or not to even vote on a bill. Those committees are all controlled by the majority party. So in September of 2018, when I'm making this, the Republican Party controls the House, the Senate, and our president is a Republican. That means that every committee and subcommittee in both chambers are chaired by a Republican and have a majority of Republicans. So when we think about the power of a majority in the House, the power of the majority in the Senate, it's not just simply that they would have a majority vote. It's that they control the committees that determine whether or not to even have the vote in the first place. All right, that is how a bill becomes a law in a nutshell. We're going to spend more time talking about the House as a chamber another day and talking about the Senate as a chamber on a separate day. Okay, thank you very much.